Thanks for tuning in to another edition of the OFN Meeting Room on the Our Lads Football Radio Network. We're going to talk Dallas Cowboys football in just a minute. Before we do that, of course, I'm going to remind everybody again, the Our Lads Draft Guide, 39 years and counting. That's, I was going to say older than me, but I'd be lying. So 39 years and counting. Mel Kiper, eat your heart out. And you can, of course, order your subscription of the Our Lads Draft Guide and the Draft Review Guide, which comes out about a month or so after. I'll have to get a definitive date on that, and I got to get Dan Schunk on this program too sometime after the draft so we can do a whole lot of talk regarding how everything transpired. So saving the best for last, but don't forget, again, ourlads.com. That's where you can order your subscription. And make sure to also subscribe to us on our YouTube channel at Prime Sports Network. Okay, let's find out about the Dallas Cowboys by welcoming in my special guest. We've had him on here before. RJ Ochoa, manager and editor-in-chief of SB Nation's Blogging the Boys. Good speaking with you again, RJ.
How's it going?
It's going all right. You tell me. I mean, this has been a busy offseason for the Cowboys. I mean, I know you probably hear this a lot, how everybody is sick and tired of the Cowboys getting all this news, especially with Dak Prescott. It's like a soap opera with Jerry Jones and Dak Prescott all the time. But this was actually an offseason. If we move Prescott on the side and we just talk about, this is a huge change with the new coaching staff, starting with Mike McCarthy.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a really fascinating few months, and first of all, hope you and all your followers and listeners and subscribers are well. Obviously, these are some turbulent times for our world, and so there's been a lot of time to focus on the NFL and the Cowboys, and there's been a lack of time, obviously, for the Cowboys to get together. They were scheduled to start OTAs 2 weeks ago now on April 6th. And so that didn't get to happen. But yeah, I mean, it's very strange. I like to think about how much the world has changed, in different perspectives and stuff like that. And I mean, you think about, what life looked like. I don't know where you were in 2010, the last time the Cowboys had a non-Jason Garrett head coach. And so, but even then, I mean, Jason Garrett's been affiliated with the Cowboys from a coaching perspective in some shape, form, or fashion since 2007. So, I mean, you really have to go all the way back to 2006 to find a coaching staff completely void of him. So it's definitely very new. And in that sense, it's sort of exciting. It's a new puzzle to try to figure out. Jason Garrett's Cowboys had, I think some people would say, grown stale, but grown predictable is what I would say. They have had certain tendencies and certain, appreciations and certain rhythms and things like that. And so it's been fun to try to understand what Coach Mike McCarthy is all about in that respect. And obviously, it's been different in the current climate. But yeah, I mean, when you factor in Dak Prescott's pending contract and getting franchise tagged, and Amari Cooper getting $20 million a year, and the team letting Byron Jones walk, I mean, there certainly has not been a shortage of things to talk about since the season ended, really.
Yeah, deservedly so. That's which was probably my point, that this is actually an off season where the Cowboys should be getting an awful lot of news. They deserve it. All right, let's talk about McCarthy. And of course, you got the last few years, the last year or so, it seemed to bounce back and forth with the offense with Garrett and Kellen Moore. And now it's going to McCarthy and Moore. So how is that going to work? Is he calling the plays? How is Mike McCarthy going to coach this team?
Well, I mean, obviously, what the Cowboys say and what they do is potentially very similar, very different. The verbiage that has, at least been the company line has been that Kellen Moore will call the plays. But to your point, obviously, Mike McCarthy's offense is very different. Had the pass happiest offense throughout his time in Green Bay over the last decade. And a lot of that is obviously due to the fact that, if you have Aaron Rodgers, it doesn't really exactly make sense to run the ball all too much. But the Cowboys obviously employ Zeke Elliott, and so that provides them with an opportunity to do some special things there as well. I think that, primarily it's going to be some sort of West Coast offense. I know that's really general and really kind of a bland answer right now. But, based on our limited knowledge right now, I think that's all we can sort of safely guess.
Okay.
Obviously, Kellen Moore, was quite prolific last season. Had the Cowboys operating at a highly efficient level, and that's something that made sense to retain. And the parallels there, with Jason Garrett are just fascinating. I mean, I don't know how well all of your listeners know Cowboys history and whatnot, but I mentioned, Jason Garrett, and his affiliation with the Cowboys. Obviously, everybody knows he played for them, backup quarterback. And if you've never watched football on Thanksgiving, you're not aware of the, heroic game he had against the Green Bay Packers on Thanksgiving in 1994. But Jason Garrett started out as the Cowboys offensive coordinator in 2007 and was this kind of young, innovative, highly sought after mind. And so you're talking about a former backup quarterback for the team that wore number 17, becomes this great offensive coordinator and kind of gets pigeonholed to his head coach. Because I think people forget, the Cowboys hired Jason Garrett as their OC in 2007 before they hired Wade Phillips to be their head coach. And so Wade kind of inherited Jason Garrett in that respect. And Mike McCarthy obviously chose to keep Kellen Moore. But so it is just kind of funny, the way history would repeat itself in that way. Perhaps Kellen Moore will be the team's head coach in 4 or 5 years. But I think free agency has shown us that Mike McCarthy has a significant amount of sway with his team, which is good and which is interesting, which is definitely very different. The Cowboys operate with the brain trust, obviously, of Steven and Jerry Jones. Will McClay, who is their sort of de facto general manager, his title always changes every year, gets a bit of a promotion. And now Mike McCarthy. And so we've seen some things that have sort of been indicative that Mike McCarthy's hands are on that process, which is good to see if you're a Cowboys fan.
Okay, and then what about the defense? Because this is maybe a little bit different because now you're bringing in someone from the outside, Mike Nolan, who hasn't been a coordinator since 2014 with Atlanta. He spent the last 3 years as the linebacker coach with the Saints. So what is Mike Nolan going to bring scheme-wise as far as any major changes that we need to keep an eye on, especially when we're thinking about the draft?
Well, there is a lot of pontificating that Mike Nolan's defense with the Cowboys could shift to more of a 3-4 defensive front than a 4-3 that the Cowboys have been playing for some time now. And I don't know that I buy that necessarily, but I don't know that I buy that any team is 100% this or 100% that. And so I do know, that Mike Nolan is a big fan of Leighton Vander Esch. And, I had Ron Slavin, Leighton's agent, on my podcast a few weeks ago, and he talked about how Mike Nolan was obsessed with Leighton when he was coaching the linebackers. Obviously, it's now been 2 years since Leighton was in the NFL draft himself. And so I think that, I think Mike Nolan certainly looks at the Cowboys defense and views what at least a year ago many people believed to be one of the more promising linebacker duos in the National Football League, and Leighton Vander Esch and Jalen Smith. The 2019 season really kind of dampened the view that people have of them. Leighton obviously dealt with injuries, and Jalen kind of wore out his welcome with a lot of Cowboys fans. He's a lot of people view him as very self-motivated, kind of focused more on his brand and things like that. He's a phenomenal story, as everybody knows, and he's a miracle in and of his own sort of medical adventure and medical road to the NFL from the tragic Fiesta Bowl day that he had, now 4 years ago. But so I think overall, I think things will be very similar. But I think that the draft will tell us a lot. There's been a lot of murmuring and a lot of discussion that the Cowboys have interest in Oklahoma linebacker Kenneth Murray. And there's a lot of Cowboys fans that would look at that as a really glass half empty approach and say, well, this clearly means that Leighton Vander Esch's injury is more severe than the Cowboys are letting on because they had to go out and draft Kenneth Murray, et cetera, et cetera. However, the glass half full approach to that, would be that, okay, maybe the Cowboys aren't necessarily, from a general standpoint, trying to replace Leighton Vander Esch and his production. Maybe they're trying to replace Jalen Smith because they are going to play some more 3-4 fronts, and therefore they need Jalen Smith to float outside and play some outside linebacker and rush the passer like we did see him do at Notre Dame.
Okay.
And so, I hate to not give you a full answer, but
what that does, though, is it does make it where opposing teams can't pigeonhole the Cowboys with their thoughts on well, you know what? I think Dallas is going to lean more towards a defensive lineman or a linebacker because they're running a 4-3 or a 3-4. The mystery is there for teams when we're just talking about where the Cowboys might decide to go with the draft. We'll of course have a better understanding after the draft ourselves, but this is actually good for the Cowboys that other teams don't know what they're planning on doing.
Certainly, and they are at least on paper very malleable. The Cowboys linebacking group, it does feature obviously Leighton and Jalen at the top. They do still have Sean Lee, who they brought back. They did re-sign Joe Thomas and Justin March, who are nice sort of role players. They still have Chris Covington, who they drafted a couple of years ago now, and so they have options. But certainly when you have that much talent at the front of the group, it does provide you with some different opportunities, especially if they were to spend their first round pick on a Kenneth Murray. If they were to draft, say, Zach Bond out of Wisconsin or something like that, I think that would be a little bit more indicative of them playing him, as a pure edge rusher all the time and not necessarily floating Jalen around. But
Okay.
I do, there's been talk among Cowboys people since Jalen was drafted, really, that maybe given his physical build and his physical abilities, that he could rush the passer.
Okay, and then quickly before we move on to specific needs and positions, there's also a new special teams coach, John Fossil, and I mentioned him because he was with the Rams for a very long time, and the Cowboys special teams unit did fare very well last year. The kicking game has been erratic, so now Greg Zuerlein is the new kicker. I know they re-signed Forbath, but Zuerlein had a pretty decent season last season. I think he did pretty well with his long kicks. He's got a powerful leg. He is an inconsistent guy in general since he's been in the league, but special teams has got to be better.
Yeah, I mean, to put it lightly, I would say that special teams were a disaster for the Cowboys last season. I know obviously people watch their own NFL team and whatnot, but the Cowboys season really broke on Sunday Night Football against the Minnesota Vikings. Dak Prescott was driving, and it kind of looked like, okay, this is an MVP drive. This is the moment, that everything changes, and this is what might propel Dak into that conversation. And the Cowboys decide down near the goal line to run the ball twice with Zeke Elliott and ultimately dunk it into the end zone. And then they're able to kind of force Minnesota to punt with, minimal time left. And Tavon Austin just fields the punt in this horrible, erratic fashion that, one of those things that everybody at home who's ever played Madden says, you never do that, and all sorts of stuff. And so, there was tons of miscommunication and tons of errors like that on special teams. So you're right, John Fossil certainly, is going to, in all likelihood, get rid of all that. He's a very efficient coach. And you mentioned Greg Zuerlein. The Cowboys' kicking game has struggled, to put it lightly, for the last 2 years. And it was 2 years ago I mentioned the Minnesota Vikings that the Cowboys cut Dan Bailey, who ultimately ended up with the Vikings. And Dan had been a phenomenal kicker for the Cowboys since he went undrafted in 2011. And the Cowboys, it's my opinion that Brett Maher, who was a 28-year-old rookie for them in 2018, replacing Dan, he was okay. I mean, just kind of your sort of average run-of-the-mill kicker, had a really big leg, and that was something that certainly was interesting to the Cowboys. But I felt like they relied, on his averageness, and they just thought, what, it's fine, kind of if it ain't broke, don't fix it sort of thing. And so they went into 2019 with Maher at the helm and paid the price for it. And I think it's circumstantial to say if we'd had, this kicker, so many games would be different. I don't know that everything plays out identically, but, Kai Forbath joined the team late in the season and through 3 games went 10 of 10 on both extra points and field goals. And you mentioned they did re-sign him. They actually re-signed him before they signed Greg Zuerlein. And kind of piecing together what happened there, it looks to me like the Cowboys preferred Greg Zuerlein, and that perhaps the Los Angeles Rams, because the Rams were set to see Michael Brockers depart free agency, if you remember, he had initially agreed to terms with the Baltimore Ravens. The Rams might have viewed the situation from the perspective of, well, we've got a little bit of cap space, Greg. That can be yours. And Greg might have said, you know what, Bones, I'd love to follow you to Dallas, but the money's fine here. I'll just stay. Moving sucks. I don't want to have to pack and everything. And then Michael Brockers and the Ravens fall apart. And so Michael Brockers returns to the Rams, and it seems like the Rams might have said, you know what, Greg, no hard feelings, but we're going to devote this cap space to Michael Brockers instead, which freed Greg. And maybe he called Bones and said, hey, I'm suddenly free. Do you still want to do this? And meanwhile, the Cowboys, just to give themselves an option, had re-signed Kai Forbath in that time and just figured, you know what? We don't want to do that. We don't want to go back into another season just kind of settling for average. Let's get our guy with 2 kickers. It's kind of weird, whatever, but we'll bring them both in. If you look at the finances of the 2 deals, it does seem like Greg is the preferred option. So I think it's about getting it right for them. And I think that's obviously the more preferred outlook to take.
Nothing wrong with competition. That's especially, even though Zuerlein, as I mentioned, has been around a long time, and he's definitely a starting kicker in this league. He has had his ups and downs. Change of scenery sometimes is good, but sometimes it's also bad, especially with kickers. You just never know how they're going to react from team to team, from year to year. Okay, let's go into some specific needs, and I'm going to go with one that's so obvious. So let's go with the obvious, definite, even though it's not going to be at the top of the list. They're not going to take it with their first pick because that's a little too high. But with Frederick on, the Cowboys need a center, don't they?
Yeah, they do. That retirement was both surprising and obviously not surprising given the intense autoimmune disorder that Travis battled 2 years ago. Certainly one of the better Cowboys, arguably one of the best draft picks of Jerry Jones's tenure as general manager of the team. But it is worth mentioning that in 2018, when they played without him, that the Cowboys started Joe Looney at center for all 16 games and into the playoffs as well. And they re-signed Joe Looney this offseason. They also re-signed Adam Redmond. They also last year, with their third round pick, the Cowboys drafted Connor McGovern out of Penn State, who has played center before. Connor that they drafted the year before in 2018, Connor Williams, has some center potential too, hailing out of the University of Texas. I'm a Texas A&M Aggie, so that's a little difficult for me to say.
Right.
But so they've got options at the very least, and they've got Joe Looney who certainly played center for them 2 years ago. Again, they've got Adam Redmond, they've got Connor McGovern. Didn't play a game for them last season, but I think all along the interior, the Cowboys aren't going to touch right guard because Zach Martin is arguably the best guard in football. But between left guard and center, they've got a variety of players and combinations that they can mess with. There have been different mocks and different things that sort of suggest the Cowboys should trade back in the first round and draft, say, Michigan, Cesar Ruiz. The poetry of that would be pretty spectacular, given that that's how the Cowboys landed Travis Frederick to begin with. And that was actually the last time the Cowboys traded back in the first round. 7 years ago, a draft following a 49ers Super Bowl loss. So lots of consistencies there. But I don't know that necessarily happens. And if the Cowboys aren't spending a top 100 pick at center, I mean, I don't know how likely it is that player, that pick is necessarily at least competing for starting snaps in 2020. Sure. But you're right. I mean, it's definitely something I imagine that they're aware of.
Yeah, and again, competition, especially since unless they do follow that trade down, take the center with your first pick kind of, because you got couple of guys, whether it's the Michigan center or Hennessy, who probably stand above everyone else at that position. So if you don't go there and you're not going to think that one of those guys is going to start day one, then okay, if you wind up grabbing another center / guard in the middle rounds and he just adds depth, then there's nothing wrong with that. So,
right.
Okay, so front seven becomes pretty big too. Now, and again, this is a guessing game because we have no idea exactly how they're going to target their needs in the front seven, but we know that they need to add another couple of players, especially some edge rushers. So talk a little bit about what your best guess would be then. Now, I don't know at 17 because that's a tricky position, especially on the defensive line. I don't anticipate unless somebody drops drastically to where the Cowboys are, that the Cowboys are going to take a defensive lineman with that pick. So linebacker is a possibility where the Cowboys are. So tell me, if the Cowboys do stay at 17, or if they trade down a little bit and they go front seven, talk a little bit about where you think they would, pinpoint where you think they would go in that front seven.
The overall front seven, I do think Kenneth Murray is a possibility, the Oklahoma linebacker.
He's the top guy,
but, I mean,
okay.
Well, I don't know that he's the top guy, but there's a lot of discussion, and actually, our followers at Blogging the Boys, how draft season can be. There are prospects that people really like and people really don't like, and so if Kenneth Murray is the pick, there would, I think, be my gauge on my read on fans is that there would be a lot of disappointed people.
Okay.
So I would definitely not say he's the top guy. Maybe I think the most preferred front seven addition that the Cowboys could make if they sit at 17 would be K'Lavon Chaisson out of LSU. Yep. There's a lot of people starting to become a big fan of his. Zach Bond out of Wisconsin, maybe a trade back situation. I think, Penn State's Yetur Gross-Matos is somebody that the Cowboys have been linked to before as well. And so I think it's also worth mentioning that, the Cowboys are not at least going to find out before the draft whether they're going to have Randy Gregory or Aldon Smith available for the 2020 season. They're waiting on Commissioner Roger Goodell to reinstate them both. And I know that there are a lot of people rooting for Randy and rooting for Alden, both in football and in life, and hoping that football can be a vehicle to get their lives back on track. But in a football sense, I think if the Cowboys are relying on both Randy or Alden Smith, that they're approaching this thing a little bit irresponsibly. I think you've just got to look at them as a surplus at this point.
Okay.
Whatever you get from them is just kind of icing on top of the cake. But to your point, the Cowboys do have to replace Robert Quinn's production, who left for the Chicago Bears. 11 and a half sacks is hard to replace
Right.
in one fell swoop. But I think that it's difficult. I think K'Lavon Chaison's probably the guy. And to your point, there aren't a lot of edge rushers that are conceivably worth the 17th overall
Yes.
pick, unless by some miracle Chase Young was available to the Cowboys. But
Yeah.
but all of this really shows, and this is a point that many people have gone in circles about over the entire offseason. It shows how badly missing on a first round pick can hurt you. It was 3 years ago the Cowboys took out of Michigan. We talked Cesar Ruiz, Taco Charlton. And that pick has just burned the Cowboys in a lot of ways. They passed on TJ Watt because TJ Watt had too short of arms for their liking, and they didn't think he would play off the edge. And so, I mean, if you want to play revisionist historian, you can go back. You can say, imagine if they take TJ Watt, then all of a sudden you have more freedom, more flexibility, et cetera, et cetera. But right now, as it stands entering the draft with Randy and Alden as question marks, the Cowboys pass rusher opposite of DeMarcus Lawrence is some combination of Tyrone Crawford and Dorrance Armstrong, which isn't exactly great.
Okay, so far that means Armstrong, things aren't working out the way that they would have liked to have seen his progression. And what about Jackson? He was picked last year in the 5th round. He also took Jelks in the 7th round. Do those guys have any shot at becoming key contributors?
You mentioned Joe Jackson out of Miami. The Cowboys took Michael and Joe Jackson in the 5th round, both out of Miami last year. No relation. It was really interesting and fun. But Joe Jackson, every year there's obviously, at BTB we refer to them as pet cats. It's an old Bill Parcellsism and stuff like that. But Jerry Jones was loving him some Joe Jackson. I mean, around training camp when the Cowboys were still in Oxnard, throughout the preseason, Joe Jackson got a lot of hype and a lot of pub and a lot of discussion. And really, there was a lot of thought that maybe, he could be something. But to be fair, there was similar discussion around Dorrance Armstrong, his rookie season coming out of Kansas. And so, that was kind of short-lived, honestly, and that really didn't take off and didn't materialize throughout the regular season. And so, I think there's potential, but I also think, again, if you're relying on, call it the combination of Tyrone Crawford and Dorrance Armstrong and Joe Jackson, I think you're going about this the wrong way. The Cowboys, for what it's worth, from an overall defensive line perspective, did add Gerald McCoy and Dontari Poe in free agency. Yep. So the group has been bolstered. However, that particular spot, needs some help. And I don't know that, given the resources and where we are, it's mid-April, late April, I don't know that you can fix that right now to the point that, you're going to feel comfortable about it, throughout the entire regular season.
And the future for Tristan Hill?
Tristan Hill was a pick that many people felt very similarly about Taco Charlton. That was a pick that last year, obviously the Cowboys did not have a first round pick because they traded away from Amari Cooper. And the Cowboys, their first pick in general the last few years, obviously Tristan, a second rounder, has been very, very telegraphed for the week leading up to things. And so I would pay very, very much attention to the names that the Cowboys are being associated with.
Okay.
The entire world knew they wanted Taco Charlton. It was the worst kept secret in the world that they wanted Leighton Vander Esch. And it was very, very well known that they preferred Tristan Hill, despite many Cowboys fans trying to will Juan Thornhill or Taylor Rapp into existence. But Tristan Hill, had an issue, I think, last season for the Cowboys. You can call it, rookie situations, rookie learnings, whatever you want. But there was a report that, they had a guest speaker the Cowboys did at one point come in, and that Tristan Hill fell asleep. Tristan Hill was inactive more often than he was active, just healthy scratch. And I think that, there are a lot of very interesting parallels with the Cowboys. I mentioned the Jason Garrett and Kellen Moore thing, but it was 2009 that the Cowboys had last not had a first-round pick because they had traded it away for a different wide receiver in Roy Williams, also made the wrong choice in the university he chose to attend. The Cowboys obviously traded for Mark Cooper, and last year's draft class is, at least right now, looks very bad. The 2009 class was one of their worst in franchise history. And if you look at what 2019 was and the contribution the Cowboys got from it, their first pick in the second round was Tristan Hill, who again was inactive more often than not. Their third round pick was Connor McGovern, who didn't play a single snap for them. Their fourth round pick was Tony Pollard, who certainly has a lot of potential, but the Cowboys would go on to pay their starting running back $90 million. Then they took Michael Jackson in the fifth, who didn't stick with the teams, now a member of the Detroit Lions. Joe Jackson, who we already discussed. So, I mean, the Cowboys essentially got almost no production from their rookie class.
Yeah.
The big level of production they got was from a backup running back. And so, that is, I think, where they stand as a whole. Really, that's why this draft is so important.
Yeah.
I think that's why people want to see them trade back. Is the Cowboys, they're very top heavy in that they have a lot of talent. And I think if all 22 starters stayed healthy for the entirety of the season, they'd probably win 10 games. But the reality is that that's probably not going to happen just based on the football of it all. And so the Cowboys need their top 100 picks to be contributors in a lot of senses. Like they were, the class of 2016 was very special with obviously Zeke and Jalen and Dak Prescott. But the Cowboys have to get some help in a lot of ways. And so that's why I don't know that they're going to have any A+ particular picks. But if they can get a handful of B+, I think they'll be sitting all right.
Well, you mentioned the last three drafts. The Cowboys, you could pretty much gauge where they were going. So can we do that this draft? Is there one of those players that we're going, well, this is probably going to be the guy?
Well, so I think if I had to boil it down, just, from, we love to gather every bit of information we can at Blogging the Boys and try to crack that code and try to put together that puzzle. That's the fun of draft season. I would say it's, if I had to put sort of a handful of guys, I think K'Lavon Chaisson's in the mix. I certainly think AJ Terrell is in the mix out of Clemson. I think Christian Fulton's in the mix. And I think some of these guys are in the mix if they trade back. And I think, again, that's what a lot of people want to see. If you told me the Cowboys could trade back, trade out of 17, pick up a third round or whatever it may be, just another top 100 pick, and still land Christian Fulton, because they do have a big need. We didn't even mention
we haven't gotten to that yet.
They let Byron Jones go in free agency. So, Christian Fulton's not going to supplement that entirely, but they're going to need help. And, it is worth mentioning that if you look ahead a year, that both Chidobe Awuzie and Jordan Lewis and Xavier Woods, for that matter, are all going to have expired contracts. And so pretty soon the Cowboys are going to need even more corners. And so it wouldn't be a bad idea to get one certainly in the first two rounds, ideally in the first round here. But K'Lavon Chaisson, AJ Terrell, Kenneth Murray is mentioned. I think all those guys are in the mix. I think, CJ Henderson's name has really kind of floated more and more over the last few weeks, but that was a name the Cowboys had been linked to a lot throughout the draft process, but it seems like he won't make it to them at 17.
No, he would have to be one of the, again, there's always going to be a player or two that will fall. So if he, and he could be that player. So, but that would be lucky. And that's why once you do get past, look, everybody knows Okuda's going to be the first guy. I think we all know Henderson's going to be the second guy. And then there's pretty much a mixed bag. And that's why you hit it on the head when you said if they are going to go with a corner with their first pick at 17, it makes a lot more sense that if Henderson's gone, that they trade down, because there's about 4 or 5 corners that can go anywhere from 20 to 35. And I don't think there's much difference in any of them. So, So that makes a lot of sense. What about, we'll close with the receivers because Witten's gone. So that. I know Schultz was a 4th round pick. And Jarwin has shown moments, but this is not a great draft for tight ends though. So is this just one of those years where maybe they just add a tight end at some point, but they're not expecting much?
I think that, if you look at the state of the Cowboys' overall pass catching group, we'll call it, obviously they re-signed Amari Cooper, and Michael Gallup had an incredible sophomore season for them. And so they seem very, very set, obviously, on the outside. I think the Cowboys absolutely have a needed slot receiver. They obviously let Randall Cobb go to the Houston Texans. They were never going to pay him that much money. They've been linked recently to Christian Kirk out of Arizona, or, Marquise Brown. And so there's a lot of different ways that they could go. Certainly, I don't know that you want to trade for somebody at this point. I think you'd probably just rather spend your own draft pick on somebody. But obviously, the Cowboys have been trying. It feels like it's been forever. They've been trying to replace what they had in the slot with Cole Beasley for the last year or so. But you mentioned tight end, and I said a little while ago that I thought that free agency was very, very good from the perspective of Mike McCarthy having control. Jason Witten is not a Dallas Cowboy, and he's still playing in the NFL. And I think that says a lot about Mike McCarthy's voice in the room. A lot of people thought, it was heavily discussed a year ago when Jason Witten returned that he was, had his eye on coaching. And there were a lot of people that thought that was the progression for him. Every Cowboys fan wants every Cowboys great to be on the coaching staff. Jason Witten can coach tight end, Sean Lee can coach linebackers, and Tony Romo can be the head coach. But I think there was a sense, I think, from a lot of Cowboys fans that there was not a spirit of nepotism, but maybe a spirit of favoritism for, franchise greats like Jason Witten. But to see the Cowboys develop kind of a cold, objective attitude towards team building was really nice to see. And I think an indication of them moving differently, which is, again, really, really nice to see. Blake Jarwin obviously has had moments, and I think a lot of people felt like his growth was inhibited by Jason Witten's return last year. And I think that, again, that said a lot, that this guy, not just some random player, but certainly one of the best players in franchise history, and Jason Witten could just walk back into the locker room after a year away and be a starter again. That did, that upset a lot of Cowboys fans. And, especially because they wanted to see Blake Jarwin kind of have an opportunity to thrive. The last game of the 2018 regular season, Blake Jarwin caught 3 touchdowns on the road against the New York Giants. And so many people thought that he would be something special. You mentioned Dalton Schultz. The Cowboys drafted him the weekend after Jason Witten retired initially in 2018. So he's kind of been somebody that's kind of hanging around. The Cowboys have been heavily linked to Devin Asiasi out of UCLA. So maybe that's sort of their third guy, their third project, or maybe fourth, because they did sign Blake Bell in free agency this offseason, the Bell Dozer. And so, I think that provides them some flexibility. And it is, I think, worth mentioning that they did sign Blake Jarwin to a contract extension this offseason.
Okay.
So they clearly view him as, a starting tight end in the NFL, certainly. I don't know that closes the door on them looking in other directions by any means. But overall, I think their offense is solid and has a lot of, toys for Dak Prescott. But I'm a big believer in Blake Jarwin, but you're right. I mean, to rely on that also would be a little unsafe, but also to your point, it's not like this is a strong tight end class anyway. But yeah, Blake Jarwin being freed is something a lot of people are excited about.
And it kind of reminds me a little bit of what you were talking about at the center position. Is that, sure, maybe it would be nice to upgrade the spot, but if the Cowboys with limited picks, if they don't trade down, if they can't accumulate more picks, and they bypass center and they bypass tight end, they still have bodies on their team that they believe can hold the fort for at least another year. So, okay. So then let's close with receiver, because that wide receiver, because this is the talk of the draft of how deep wide. I mean, you're going to be able to Cowboys. Well, first there's 2 questions. One, what if one of the top 3 slides to 17? And of course, Judy, Ruggs, or Lamb. Is that a no-brainer that the Cowboys would run after one of those guys? And then the second question would be, all right, they don't go wide receiver with their first pick. They want to go after a slot guy in the 3rd, 4th round, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, you got guys like, James Prochet. I know one of your favorites, Duvernay. You love that school he went to. So there are guys that you can get in the 3rd or 4th round that could fit. And look, even Cole Beasley, it wasn't a high draft pick. You don't need those guys. Don't have to get picked high. If you make the right choice and the right player fits, you can get that guy in the middle round to late rounds. And this is definitely a draft where you can accomplish that.
Certainly. You mentioned Devin Duvernay again. Everybody's judgment can be forgiven at one point in time or another. Laviska Shenault is another guy.
I love Shenault.
It feels like every year there's just a handful of guys, right? Like if I'm just going to reach my hand in the slot receiver bag and I'm going to pluck one out, and there's always one that kind of pops off. Obviously, like Cooper Kupp was somebody that a lot of people really, really loved, and last year a lot of people loved Andy Isabella and stuff like that. And so And I think that maybe, Andy Isabella actually, provides the Cowboys, if Christian Kirk, who did make the correct decision in his higher learning, if he is, if the Cardinals, finish this draft and feel satisfied, maybe Christian Kirk is on the trade block. And maybe for the Cowboys, you don't get the guy you like, maybe you revisit
Sure.
that. If a CeeDee Lamb were to be on the board at 17, if things were to shake that
Yeah.
way, speaking for myself, I am all about that. There's a sector of Cowboys fans on Twitter that have affectionately nicknamed themselves Team 40 Burger, and they want to see that pick. They so badly want to see that pick, and that would be fun. I mean, that would be the most fun thing that could happen for the Cowboys if one of those receivers
Yep.
fell. And they just, and a lot of people have equated this to sort of a Zach Martin type situation. I think a lot of people, when the Cowboys took Zach now 6 years ago, viewed it as not quite a luxury selection, but they already viewed the Cowboys as offensive line rich. Why do you need another offensive lineman, et cetera? But he was simply just the best player on the board when they were on the clock. And so I think it would be a similar effect if it was CeeDee Lamb. And I know he's been mocked to the Cowboys in several different circumstances by some high profile draft analysts. If you asked me to power rank again, what would be the most fun?
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
by far that's number one. And I think it would be hard because you can pick whoever. I mean, like we've said, CJ Henderson's not going to be there, whatever. So if the conversation and the debate is seriously between CeeDee Lamb and K'Lavon Chaisson and Trayvon Diggs, whatever. I mean, all respect to those other players, but CeeDee Lamb is far and away the best talent on the board, and I think you have to do it. But something we didn't mention that I think would be the second most fun option is if the Cowboys, I think that they maybe have, and I wrote about this recently. The Cowboys were connected to having interest in Dre Kirkpatrick, the former cornerback for the Cincinnati Bengals. And so I think it's possible that the Cowboys have looked at this situation and said, none of the corners that we really, really love are going to be there at 17. None of the safeties that we like enough are going to be worth the 17th overall pick. So how can we, fix this situation? Obviously, our secondary is in dire need. We mentioned the Cowboys lost Byron Jones. They also, for what it's worth, lost Jeff Heath to the Las Vegas Raiders as well. I mean, the Cowboys were heavily connected to Jamal Adams at the trade deadline last year. I mean, if you told me the Cowboys, looked at it and said, look, Jamal Adams is by far a better player than any corner or any safety that we could walk away with in this draft, even if we had the number one overall pick for whatever, conversation's worth. Let's trade 17 for Jamal Adams. Let's sign Dre Kirkpatrick or whoever just to kind of stop the bleeding at cornerback for a year. I mentioned, how a year from now, Chidobe Awuzie, Jordan Lewis, and Xavier Woods will all be free agents, and assuming no extensions between now and then. So you're going to need some sort of crossover between the current regime and whatever you decide to kind of do in the future. Jamal Adams is a great middle of that Venn diagram. I think that,
Well, we lost RJ. There you are, RJ. We lost you a second. You're back.
Yeah, I was saying, if the Cowboys, viewed the situation as no cornerback that we could draft at 17 is worth that pick, and the same goes for corner or safety. Let's just trade that pick for Jamal Adams. I mean, that's
I'm a Jet fan, RJ. So let's have this conversation because I'm going to tell you right now, and I've said this before. I said this about these rumors. There is no way Joe Douglas can trade Jamal Adams for a first-round draft pick. No way. He means so much more to the Jets than first overall. Okay, maybe let's talk about it. But you don't know what kind of wrath Joe Douglas would have if he traded Jamal Adams for the 17th pick and some crumbs in later rounds. He'd get crucified. It's just there's just no way I see that happening. Now, crazier things have happened. Maybe there's some stuff behind the scenes where Douglas just knows this is the best time to trade him because he's got 2 years to go. He's got the most leverage, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and he knows Jamal Adams doesn't want to be here for whatever reason, even though that's not even something that I think is happening. I think this is just all media hype stuff. I don't believe any of this, but it could happen. And if it does, I'm telling you right now, if he gives up Adams for just a middle round, first round draft pick and crumbs, he'll get crucified.
Well, I don't think any Cowboys fan would care.
I know, I know,
Honestly,
I know.
yeah,
I'm just
right.
saying that I don't think. I think my point, I guess, is I think it's going to take more than that.
And I think that there's certainly more than fair amounts of logic to that point. But I think every Cowboys fan, until the 17th overall pick is spent in whatever way,
Yeah.
is going to hold out hope that that's a
Hey, I
possibility.
would
You
too.
know,
I would too.
and I think there was obviously a lot of connection between the Cowboys and Earl Thomas following the
Yeah, that's
2017
right. Yeah.
season. And that initially the Seattle Seahawks wanted the second round pick that became Connor Williams again, who made the wrong choice in his collegiate career.
Yeah, boy, to just keep doing it.
That price ultimately fell, and so there were reports that the Jets wanted some combination of Zach Martin or Tyron Smith for Jamal Adams, which was obviously ridiculous. And
Well, there you go.
to your point though, I wonder how much time and how much pressure and how much whatever has happened between then and now has changed the circumstances. And I think if the Cowboys walked away with Jamal Adams after this week is over, I think whatever went into it, barring a catastrophe, most people will be pretty pleased.
Oh yeah, I would imagine so. And we didn't even mention Clinton Dix, so that definitely is a big help considering some of the losses in the defensive backfield.
It was so interesting, the free agents the Cowboys brought in this offseason were kind of predictable. I wrote something right after their coaching staff got finalized, and it was, I didn't, to be honest, I didn't spend a lot of time on it, but it was just 5 free agents with ties to the new Cowboys coaching staff that they could sign in free agency. One of them was Greg Zuerlein because of John Fossil, and one of them was Clinton Dix. And so to land 40% of that, I feel pretty pleased. But I think it should be mentioned. Not only played for Mike McCarthy, but last year when the big Bleacher Report, Aaron Rodgers, Mike McCarthy expose came out, and it was really, really bad and looked badly for Mike McCarthy. Came out and defended Mike McCarthy, kind of the only Packer to do so. Had a tweet that was, to the degree of, I don't get, he's like, I'm grateful. I didn't play on offense. I don't get why everybody had such a beef with him. I always respected him, etc. So that just seemed really obvious to me. And there were a lot of people that liked for the Cowboys when he was coming out of the draft. But I mentioned if the Cowboys, if they did want to sign Drake Kirkpatrick, they also this offseason signed Savion Smith, who most recently played in the XFL. So Savion both played for Alabama. Drake Kirkpatrick played for Alabama. The Cowboys obviously could draft Trayvon Diggs or Xavier McKinney even, who played for Alabama. Jason Garrett, his Cowboys in his entire career drafted one Crimson Tide player. So it seems like those days are over as the Cowboys, are bringing in as many as they can, it looks like.
Or who knows, maybe Jerry Jeudy or Ruggs.
That would be fun.
Yeah.
That would be a lot of fun.
Lamb, okay, but it also could be one of those Alabama guys too. All right.
Sure.
Great job as always, RJ, at RJ Ochoa. So that's where we can find you on Twitter. And hopefully we'll get a chance to talk to you after the draft, especially if the Cowboys wind up making some big news and some couple of big trades or anything significant comes out of Dallas. We'd like to have you on again at some point after the draft and before the season begins.
Definitely. I'd love that. I hope you and again, your audience is doing well. Obviously some stressful times for our world, and all the best to you guys.
Thanks, RJ.